Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. My name is Grant Johnson. I'm the Conservation Project Manager with the Coastal San Luis Resource Conservation District. Today we're going to be going over our demonstration project, which is through the CDFA's Healthy Soils Program. How this is going to be set up is we have two videos that we've made with the help of the Brock Center at Cal Poly. And the first video is kind of going to be a little background on the project, while the second one gets more into the soil science and the testing that we did. On the call today, we'll have Charlotte DeCock, who is a soil science professor at Cal Poly, and she can answer all the questions that anyone has around that. And then also we have Kevin Piper, who's the agricultural operations manager at Cal Poly. And also Sam Hoffman, who is a mechanical engineer with Tillage Management. And they're the company that rented us the implement that we use to achieve the reduced tillage. So we have a big panel to answer any questions that may arise. So just a little housekeeping. If everyone can keep their audio on mute during the videos, and then after the videos, we'll have 5 to 10 minutes to answer any questions. So feel free to unmute yourselves to answer questions or just type them into the Q&A box. Okay, let me pull up the video now.
Hello, my name is Grant Johnson. I'm the Conservation Project Manager with the Coastal San Luis RCD. We're here at the Chorro Ranch, which is the site for our HSP demonstration project. Back in the spring or the summer of 2020, the RCD completed a carbon farm plan for Cal Poly's rangelands. I think Cal Poly has around 4 ranches that we included in the project, and the Chorro Ranch was one of those projects. At the Chorro Ranch is a combination of rangeland and also cropland. I think they have around 100 acres of dryland hay production here. And so in the carbon farm plan, we identified ways for them to sequester carbon in these working landscapes. And at this ranch, on these fields, reduced tillage and also compost application was identified as a strong tool to sequester carbon into these soils. And so we were able to apply for funding through the CDFA program for an HSP demonstration project here. HSP is the Healthy Soils Program. And so the Coastal San Luis RCD partnered up with Cal Poly again to apply for that funding, and we began a project out here. So there are 4 different treatments in this field. There's conventional tillage with no compost application. There's conventional tillage with compost. There's also reduced tillage with no compost and reduced tillage with compost. That lets us see the effects of those treatments, the combined effects, and also the effects of them on their own. And so this is a 3-year study looking at the soil effects, the biological and agronomic results from these different treatments. So the reduced tillage is accomplished by using a one-pass till implement that's towed behind the tractor. And so while conventional tillage would use multiple implements and take 3 or 4 passes to accomplish the preceding tillage, the one-pass tillage implement, it reduces the negative effects of tilling by only passing the land once. So that reduces the compaction from the tractor driving over it. It also reduces the emissions from the tractor, and also the amount of, since all of the tilling is happening in one pass, there's less like dust emissions, which that is a main cause of the carbon getting blown off the soil, is when they pass many times, it releases the soil in the air. The experimental area is located at the center of the field in a 300 by 600 foot zone that is split into 3 blocks. Each block is split into 2 strips, one with the conventional and one with a reduced tillage. Each tillage strip is further divided into 2 sub-blocks, one with the compost amendment and one without. This split plot design includes a total of 12 treatment plots, randomized within each block.
Hello, I'm Charlotte DeCook. I'm an assistant professor of soil health and fertility at Cal Poly. I'll talk a little bit more today about the field site that we're on here, where we have our experimental trial, where we're testing the effect of compost application and reduced tillage in forage production systems. All right, so Grant already talked a little bit about why we chose these management practices of reduced tillage and compost application. These were the practices that were identified in the carbon farm plan to have great potential to help sequester carbon. When it comes to reduced tillage, the main mechanism that helps reduce tillage to sequester carbon is that tillage is actually a pretty intensive disturbance to your soil. Soils have structure, and that structure is developed by the action of organic matter and soil organisms that make little aggregates. These organisms use the soil organic matter as a glue to stick particles together into aggregates. And these aggregates are really important in the soil because they help you hold on to water, they help you to hold on to nutrients, they provide habitat for organisms in the soil. And the more intensively you till, the more likely you are going to destruct these aggregates. And once the aggregates are destructed, you have to start over from scratch, or the microorganisms have to start over from scratch to put these aggregates back together. So if we are able to prepare a seed bed while disturbing the soil less, we will be able to keep more of the integrity of these aggregates. And that's going to have benefits to our soil biology and also to our carbon sequestration, because a lot of the carbon in our soil tends to be physically protected inside of these aggregates. When it comes to compost application, what does that do for our carbon sequestration and our soil health? Well, for starters, compost consists for a great deal out of carbon. So it's a net input of carbon into our soil. Now, not all the carbon that we're adding in that compost is going to stay in the soil. A lot of it is going to be used as food for microorganisms. So microorganisms are going to decompose part of that carbon, and that is going to basically escape as carbon dioxide. But a good portion of that carbon is also going to stay in the soil and then be able to contribute to help to build these aggregates. It's also going to provide food for these microorganisms, and we know that these microorganisms are not only important for creating aggregates, but they also do a lot of beneficial things in our soil. For example, they convert nutrients from one chemical form into the other. We apply nutrients to our fields, and these nutrients can take different forms, and there's only certain forms of these nutrients that can be taken up by the plant. So microorganisms help with converting these nutrients from plant available to plant unavailable forms and vice versa. So having these microorganisms well fed so they can do their job and make sure that the plant gets what they need, what the plants get what they need, is going to be important. So the field we're on here is on a croply clay soil. And if you are interested in knowing what kind of soil type you have on your field, I really recommend using this really handy app. The app is called Soil Web, and it was developed by some researchers at UC Davis. You can download this app through your app store, and then once you're in the field, you just pull up your app and you click on this little button on the app that says Get Soil Data. And when you do that, it will just pull in the soil data for your particular field that you're standing in. So when I do this for this particular field here, I will find that 85% of this field has been mapped as croply clay. So a really cool thing about this app is that when you pull this up, you see actually the soil profile of the soil that you're in. So what I can tell immediately when I look at this information on this app is that the soil has a big A horizon. The A horizon is the topsoil, the really fertile layer of your soil. That A horizon here goes to basically a foot deep, so a really nice big A horizon. And then we also have a really big deep B horizon. The B horizon is where the clay accumulates in your soil. This soil is mapped as a croply clay, so this soil has more than 50% clay in it. And something that's really particular about the clay in the soil here is that it's one of these clays that shrinks and swells. So we see these really big cracks here when the soil dries up. So this is a clayey soil, a really heavy soil. And so this is a field that can be pretty challenging to manage and cultivate because of how heavy these clays are. So even though these clays come with a lot of inherent soil fertility, from a physical soil properties kind of view, these clays can be pretty challenging to manage. Another thing that's really exciting about this app here is that you can toggle through some of the very exciting soil properties in this app. So when you go to the details on your soil, there's this little menu where you can look at the profile of various properties over depth. So what we can see here is, for example, that in the top 2 feet, we have up to 1.4% organic matter as mapped for the soil, and then it drastically drops as you go below the top 2 feet. You can also look at the profile of clays along your depth profile or sand. You can look at saturated hydraulic conductivity, which is a metric of how easily water will move through your soil under saturated conditions. So all these soil properties sort of like specified over the depth profile are very easily accessible through this app. Now, of course, the NRCS developed these really, really extensive and useful databases on soils, and this data is available through this app, and this is data that is part of the NRCS soil survey. But of course, they didn't dig a soil pit and do a survey in every single acre of land in the country, right? So they had to do a little bit of guesswork of where one soil type starts and the other soil type ends. So what we did to verify that what's mapped here is actually what we have on this field is Kevin Piper, the director of ag operations here at Cal Poly, came out with a backhoe and dug a pit. And we were able to verify that the layers that are shown on the app are actually also what you have in this field. And when you go to the map on the soil survey of this area, you will see that actually towards that edge of the field over there, there's another soil type that comes in. And we can actually see that the grass or the stubble that's left is a little bit browner over there compared to the rest of the field. And it clearly indicates that the soil is sort of changing there, and you can see it in the crop. So you're probably, if you're a rancher, you're probably pretty familiar with your ranch, and you probably know where you have soils that are more sandy or clayey. But by looking at the app, it actually gives you an insight into, okay, what does that profile look like deeper down? It allows you to identify if you have layers that have carbonates, which could affect the pH of your soil, or it gives you an idea of the different soil types you might have on your property, and gives you an idea of where soils might transition from one type into another, and you might choose to delineate your fields based on the soil types that you have on your property.
Okay, awesome. All right, we'll open the floor up if anyone has any questions off the bat. Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat box.
Charlotte, I have a question for you about the app. and the reliability of the data from NRCS. You mentioned obviously they can't sample every spot in every acre in every location. And you said the pit that Kevin dug seemed to match the soil type that was came from the app. Do you have any sense for how accurate the data are? It seemed like it might be really accurate if you're in Nebraska or something, but in California with its topography, it might be a lot more problematic.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're spot on. The more heterogeneous your landscape is in terms of relief and vegetation types and ecosystems, the more different, the more likely you're going to have different soil types within a certain region closer together. And but the app does give you an idea of what to expect, what is likely going to be around. If you really want to know in more detail at a higher resolution than what the app provides. Some people map their particular property to get more details, but at least the app gives you a general idea of what you're most likely going to find, and it gives you an idea of what's around you. So I always recommend to not just look at the soil type, at the specific coordinates where you are, but also sort of look at what are the soil types that are surrounding the field you're in. And so if there's a transition pretty close to the field you're in, it's likely that some of that other soil type is also bleeding into your field. And then another part to that question is that some soil properties we refer to as inherent soil properties, and these are soil properties that basically don't change. Like, for example, the horizons, so the different layers we have in a soil, that's pretty fixed for a specific location. Or the texture, like the texture is something that develops on a geological timescale and that you're not going to change through management. Whereas other things, like, for example, the carbon profile gives you an idea of what you could expect to find in general terms, but carbon is so much impacted by management that that data in the web soil survey is not going to be very accurate typically.
Thanks.
We had a question from Craig, who's asking, is there a way to quantify aggregates, something a grower can do with lab services?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is definitely a way to quantify aggregates. We do an aggregate size fractionation, and we use basically wet sieving. So we basically shake the soil with water and pass it through sieves with different mesh sizes. And then based on that, we say, okay, we have so much of our soil is in this aggregate size fraction, and so much of our soil is in that aggregate size fraction. You can also do an aggregate stability test. So you're basically agitating the soil and seeing how much of the soil holds together versus falls apart. And you can take it to a very, very simple level where you, for example, just take a vase and you take a clump of soil and you put it in the vase. If it holds together, it's a good sign. You have probably a lot of water stable aggregates in your soil. If it just shatters and falls apart and basically makes the entire, all the water in the vase like brown and mucky, it means that you have really poor water stable aggregates in your soil. So there's different ways to get at this question of looking at aggregates and aggregate stability. About the question of lab services that offer this, I think I only know of one place that does it, and it's the Cornell Soil Health Lab. I think they still offer commercial services, but I'm not 100% sure. But I don't know of anyone else who does it. And if someone else knows of someone who does it commercially, I'd be, actually really glad to learn about it. But I'm not aware of anyone besides potentially the Cornell Soil Health Lab, who offers this service commercially.
And then this is probably a question for Kevin. What kind of compost is being used?
Can you ask that again?
What kind of compost is being used for the study?
What kind of compost did we use?
Yeah.
Okay, our compost that we make at Cal Poly is a manure-based compost. And that's made up of basically manure sources from all our animal units. And then we take all of the green waste that's generated on campus and grind that up. And that becomes another component for our compost. It helps with the CN ratio when we're mixing the manures with the green waste.
Awesome. And now, real quick, I was wondering if Sam from Tillage Management could kind of talk a little bit about the implement that was used. I'm going to pull up a photo I have of it. So I'll screen share again real quick.
Okay. This is
Kind of get an idea.
this is the tillage management optimizer. It's a multi-pass tool. I mean, it's single. It's designed to reduce passes, and does that by having discs in the front, and it has rippers behind, and by hitting the soil, by not letting the soil dry out in between all the different implements hitting it, you don't lose a lot of moisture that way. And it's easier to go through because the soil doesn't have time to harden up. And we hit with the first, the discs, they handle about 8 inches. They go down about 6 to 8 inches. And then those rippers are going down 16 inches right behind it. So the rippers don't have to really work the first 8 inches because the discs have already loosened up. And then we have the rollers really control the aggregate. They try to prevent soil stratification by mixing it and mixing all the layers together and reducing the clods. And so you have in the front, we have 5-blade baskets, 5-blade mid-reels. And in the back, we go to 6 blades. And then we have a roller just trying to pat it down so you don't, to give you a nice finish that, so you prevent moisture loss and yeah, just to give you a nice finish.
Thank you.
And I'll just weigh in. This is a really cool tool to be able to use. I know from our classic way of working fields, when we brought this piece of equipment in and utilized it, we were amazed, even based on our heavy clay soils, that one pass made, did a really nice job, and we saw the benefits with that. And the staff that I work with, they were excited to use it because we typically have, different, multiple tools that we're having to use to prepare soil, and to have an implement like this is to demonstrate it is pretty cool. So thanks, Sam.
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, it's just designed to reduce passes. So it just does, and it does that by it does that mainly, like I was saying, because of the soil. The soil doesn't have time to dry out in between passes, so it's a lot easier to hit it right after than if you wait a day or two, and then you lose less topsoil that way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay. Are there any more questions or anything I missed in the chat before we move on to the next video? If not, I can get the next one pulled up.
Yeah, I just have a real quick question. You mentioned the RCD had collaborated on creating a carbon farming plan for this site. Is that plan available? Could we access that online and look at the work that was done there?
I believe so, yeah. I'm not sure if it's on our website or on if you can get it via Cal Poly, but I can make that available to the group after the webinar. Okay. So I'll get the next one pulled up. Here we go.
We are wrapping up the first season of our field trial here. Way back when we started this trial, we took soil samples before we even implemented the treatments. The reason we took these soil samples at the beginning of the trial was to establish a baseline. We wanted to know what the soil properties were across this field site here before starting the experiment. We took these soil samples with a soil core that allows us to take what we refer to as undisturbed soil samples. So this is basically a core that you pound into the soil with a sliding hammer. And by doing that, you're able to get one intact piece of soil out of the ground. And that allows us to take a sample without really disturbing the physical properties of our soil too much. So by doing that, we're able to then measure bulk density on that sample, and we're able to actually analyze aggregation in that sample. So that's what we're planning to do. And we're actually gonna come back next fall to take our next soil measurement. And we're very much looking forward to see whether our treatments at that time will have impacted the properties in that soil. So after the soil sampling, we implemented the treatment. So we applied the compost and tilled the soil, either by conventional tillage or reduced tillage. And then we started taking measurements of a number of physical soil properties throughout the season, approximately once a month. So we took measurements of unsaturated hydraulic conductivity, which represents infiltration rates. We took measurements of soil moisture, and then we also took measurements of surface and subsurface hardness. To measure the unsaturated hydraulic conductivity, we used a device that's called or referred to as a mini disc infiltrometer. This is our mini disc infiltrometer. It basically has two compartments that we fill with water. And this allows us to create a head. On the bottom here, there is a porous membrane. And so as I'm holding it up here, nothing is running out of this infiltrometer. But as soon as I put it on the ground, the water in this infiltrometer is going to start going down because the suction in the soil pores is going to allow that water to move out of this infiltrometer. So this is how we measure these infiltration rates. We collect data over time. We basically look at where the water level is and track how fast the water level drops over time. And then we fit a curve on that allows us to estimate the unsaturated hydraulic conductivity. We have done this throughout this season, and we found that the infiltration tended to be a little faster in the beginning of the season compared to towards the end. But in general, there was no impact of the treatments on the unsaturated hydraulic conductivity. So that means that reduced tillage and compost application have no effect on unsaturated hydraulic conductivity. Let me talk now a little bit about the surface and subsurface hardness. To measure that, we used this device, which is called a penetrometer. So basically what this device entails is it has this little tip here that can measure pressure. So we push it down in the soil, And as we push it down, the pressure is being recorded. To determine surface hardness, we push it down to 6 inches deep and take the maximum pressure in the first 6 inches. Then we continue pushing it down between 6 and 18 inches, record the highest pressure between 6 and 18 inches, and that is referred to as the subsurface hardness. In regards to the treatments here, we did not see any impact of the compost application rate or the tillage strategy on the surface or the subsurface hardness. When it comes to the subsurface hardness, we were in a measurement range that would have been rated as good by the Cornell Soil Health Assessment. But when it comes to the surface hardness, our surface hardness would have been rated as medium to poor. So it seems like there's opportunity to improve the surface hardness at this particular field site. The third physical property we tracked throughout the season was soil moisture. To measure soil moisture, we used the soil moisture sensor. This type of sensor measures volumetric soil moisture, so the volume of water per volume of soil. So it gives you a measure that could be seen as a percentage of moisture in the soil on a volume basis. This is different from another type of moisture sensors that some of you may be familiar with, which is referred to as a tensiometer. So as opposed to measuring a volume of water, the tensiometer measures water tension. So it measures the water potential in the soil. And so what that is basically conceptually a measure of is how hard your plant would have to pull to be able to get water out of the pores in the soil. When it comes to our soil moisture, we also didn't see any impact of the treatments quite yet. In this first year of our trial, there were, of course, fluctuations throughout the season, depending on whether it had rained or not. But in general, there was no impact of compost application rate or tillage on the amount of volumetric moisture content we had in that soil. So last but not least, at the end of the season, before they came in to mow the hay, we took yield measurements. To do that, we used a frame. It was an 18-inch by 18-inch frame, and we cut all the biomass within that frame. We took 2 of these frames per plot, and as for all the soil physical properties we measured, there was also no impact of the compost application rate or the tillage on the yield. Good news, though, is that for some reason, we had a booster crop this year. The yield for this hay was about 5 tons per acre, which is pretty high for this region. So even though we had a really dry year this year, we got a pretty good crop out of this field site. Then the hay was baled plot by plot. And then after the hay was baled, we actually came in and took subsamples of the hay to send off for feed analysis. And we're still waiting to hear back from the lab to see if the treatments had any impact on the quality of the hay. So far, we haven't seen any effects of the compost or the tillage treatment on all the things that we have measured on this field site. When it comes to yield, that's actually a great sign, because some people are worried that reducing the tillage intensity will decline their yields. This was not the case in this particular trial. When it comes to the compost application, we applied 5 tons per acre. Compost improves the soil by building soil organic matter. If you only apply compost 1 time at 5 tons per acre, it is to be expected that your impact might be minimal. If you wanted to see a big impact in the first year, you would have probably had to apply a higher rate of compost so that you're actually making a significant impact on the nutrients that you're providing through that compost into the soil. However, research that has been published from field trials that have taken place for longer periods of time that have shown that repeated compost application, even at these low rates, year after year after year, ultimately improve the soil health and then can have positive impacts on, for example, the capacity of your soil to hold on to water, or on, for example, the amount of nutrients that can be released from that soil to feed the crop. So we're looking forward to continue this trial and to have an opportunity to look potentially at some longer term impacts of these treatments on soil and crop health when it comes to forage production.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte, for all that information. Impressive. You can just talk that fluidly about it. Yeah. Any questions? I just got one in the chat from Teresa. How do you measure the amount of carbon sequestered?
Yeah, so measuring carbon sequestration can be a little bit challenging because the precision of the types of instrument we have to measure carbon in the soil is such that it takes a little while to measure a significant increase against the analytical precision of the instrument. Just because there's already a lot of carbon typically in the soil, and the increases are small compared to what's already there on a year-to-year basis, it's really hard to pick up these really small increases. So typically, we would expect to not be able to measure an increase in total carbon in the soil until maybe, if you're lucky, 3 or it could be 5 or 10 years after you change your management effect. But the way we measure it is we take the soil, we dry it, we oven dry it. So we take a little bit of soil, we homogenize it, we stick it in an oven so all the water is out of it. And then we run it on a combustion analyzer. So basically the analyzer combusts the sample, converts all the organic matter in the soil to CO2 and nitrogen gas, and then it has detectors that can quantify the amount of CO2 and nitrogen gas that was generated through that combustion. We do have a few things that we can measure that are a little bit more sensitive to changes in management. In this particular project, we're measuring what is referred to as mineralizable carbon or soil respiration. So it's basically a measure of microbial activity. That doesn't directly necessarily relate to carbon sequestration because we know that we need good microbial activity to be able to turn that compost into a source of carbon that's more stable in the soil. But as we're doing it, we're also losing some of our carbon as CO2, right? But it just gives you, it's a more sensitive metric that gives you an idea of whether your soil as a system is responding to the management that's being applied to the field. There's also other ways people measure carbon sequestration, for example, through the use of eddy covariance towers. So these are basically sensors that are put a few feet, maybe 8 to 15 feet above the field, depending on the footprint you're looking at. And they use basically little swirls in the atmospheric air and these concentrations to model the CO2 balance. So how much is being put into the system from photosynthesis and how much is being released to CO2. But that's a pretty intensive and pretty costly measurement to get at that carbon sequestration a different way. And it's challenging to do in plot trials because you really have the sensor above a field and it looks at the entire footprint of the field. So yeah, I think the best way to measure carbon sequestration is really to be patient and measure it at the time where you could have where you can actually measure the increase in total carbon in the soil with analytical precision.
Okay, thank you. So Jim was wondering if we considered an additional treatment or treatments applying more than 5 tons of compost per acre. We haven't considered that for trial because we're trying to maintain the same treatment each year. And although this was just year one, kind of written in our contract, what we're going to be doing the next 3 years. But there are other demonstration projects that kind of are changing the amount of compost or the how often it's applied. And so hopefully we can get the data from all those other trials and be able to present those sometime.
Yeah, I can even elaborate on that a little bit. Like currently for the incentives program, so where ranchers and farmers can apply for funding to adopt these practices, the CDFA doesn't want you to apply more than 5 tons per acre. And the reason is that they did an assessment, and they decided that if you apply 5 tons per acre, the amount of nitrogen that is going to be mineralized from that is going to be small relative to the total nitrogen you put in. And they were really worried about incentivizing a practice that was going to lead to over application of nitrogen. But when it comes to rangeland now, they have in the last call for research projects, they have given some funding to projects that were applying larger amounts of compost to the rangeland as like a one-time application, similar to what's been happening in the Marin Carbon Project, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. And one of the things, we actually have another project at Cal Poly where we're assessing whether there's this trade-off with nitrogen pollution or phosphorus pollution when you have these higher compost application rates. So it's to be determined.
Thanks, you guys.
So Kat was wondering, was the moisture content measured before and after tillage? Was performed to detect any difference between moisture loss from conventional tillage compared to reduced tillage?
Yeah, so we did not measure the moisture content before and after tillage. We started measuring roughly once a month after the treatments were applied. But even though we didn't have the before and after tillage moisture measurements, we do have the different treatments. So we have the control treatment that has conventional tillage with versus without compost. And then we have the treatment with reduced tillage with versus without compost. So rather than looking at pre versus post implementation of the treatment, we're comparing different treatments side by side, so to say.
Charlotte, one question I have for you is, what are like kind of the leading and lagging indicators for soil health? Like where do we expect to see a change first out of all these different things we're measuring?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think smaller pools that are more closely related to microbial activity are typically more sensitive. So for example, in other projects, we have been measuring a pool of carbon that's referred to as active carbon or manganate oxidizable carbon, and that seems to respond faster. Oftentimes, aggregates respond faster than total carbon as a metric, and oftentimes what responds the fastest is anything that directly measures the microbial community composition. So for example, when you do microbiome analysis and you just extract DNA and do genome sequencing to look at how the microbial community changes, like many management practices do change the microbial community. One of the challenges we're at now, and this is sort of like the frontier or the crossroads in soil science, is what does that mean? Because if you don't see any treatment effect of any of the agronomic metrics that we usually use to evaluate our system, but still the microbial community changes, is it because we're not measuring things that are relevant in our typical assessment of our systems? Or is it because there's so much what we call functional redundancy in the microbial community? So meaning there's so many guys in the soil there that can do the same thing, that even if the community structure changes, it doesn't really have an effect on the total functioning of your system. So this is one of the questions we're trying to address as soil scientists right now. So what does it mean if the community changes? At what point is it problematic versus not? So long answer short, anything that directly measures the microbial community, you're probably going to have the fastest response. But if you want to look at ecosystem functioning, there's still some questions on what to really measure. That's more sensitive than our typical agronomic indicators that we've been measuring for decades.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions out there? So I'm gonna, right now in the chat, I'm gonna put in a Google form, kind of like the ones everyone filled out. I'll also be sending it via email afterwards, but you only have to fill it out once, but just want to get it out there. If anyone can fill it out, it'd be awesome. And then also, I was just going to ask Kevin a question, like, so with the reduced tillage implement, how do you see it, like, from an agricultural operations standpoint, like, how do you see it benefiting the, kind of the operations of the farm?
From our standpoint, the tool, the benefits of using that tool is efficiency with our time. Since we have a limited number of staff, and really looking at the amount of time we currently spend preparing fields for seeding, the tool would be a benefit from the standpoint of preparation time, fuel, see a savings in fuel. And then as we talked about, hopefully through this project, we can, demonstrate the fact that we're seeing some improvement in the soil tilth between the plots, and we'll see what happens. But I just like the fact, and I've seen a number of them around, and Sam can expand on that, but I've seen plenty of them being used up in the Salinas Valley with, larger scale farms in preparation. And so I would imagine some of the things that I've mentioned are some of the reasons why you're seeing this tool being used by other operations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I can expand on that a little bit. People that really like the tool generally, like you said, it's time constraints. So if they have a limited amount of time, limited amount of labor to get ready for planting, and if the rain's coming, you only have a certain amount of time before you have to work your fields. So this allows you to get it done in time to beat the weather most of the time. So,
have there been any studies done with, I guess, the time savings or fuel cost savings of using this implement, or reduction in the particulate matter emissions?
Kat, do you want to take that?
Oh,
Okay.
You're muted, Kat.
How's that?
Good.
All right. So the EPA study that we did calculated a rough 3 times shorter using the optimizer plus a deep chisel before it than conventional tillage.
Oh, wow. You said that 3 tons. Wait, what was that?
3 times, yeah, right. It's 3 times the speed to complete your tillage with the optimizer than with conventional tillage.
Wow.
Sorry, 3 times the time savings. So
Yeah.
1/3 of the speed. Sorry. Yeah, 1/3 of the speed, the time it takes.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty huge, especially at scale.
Hey, Grant, I've got a question for Charlotte, if we have time.
Yeah.
I just filled out my post-attendee.
Yeah.
And my question that I thought I'd ask there, I'll ask now is, I grow organic table grapes and wine grapes. So it's a different crop, but some of the same stuff. I add the compost to the soil. I'm trying to maximize the quality and the amount of my crop, especially the table grapes more than the wine grapes. But I'd like to do good on, protecting my soil, carbon capture for, the good of the planet. How do I do both? I want to maximize the good of all that, those products I put in. I mix them with those soil microorganisms, water and air, and they burn it all up. But it's available to my plant. I'm all happy, but I'm not happy about the atmosphere.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? Because yeah, they do have to burn it up to release the nutrients and stuff, but they actually also do have to burn it up to some degree to be able to actually sequester the carbon in the soil to the point where it becomes soil organic matter. So when you add your compost, part of that is going to be used by microorganisms and blown off as CO2, just like the way we eat and respire for generating energy. But part of it is also going to be basically assimilated into the biomass of the microbes, and going to be assimilated into secondary metabolites and enzymes and all these kind of organic compounds that are being produced during that decomposition. And it's all these compounds that are actually ultimately then ending up in the soil organic matter and forming that nice, what we think of as humus, where the soil is like nice and dark and it feels like it has good tilt and so on. And so it's really not a bad thing that they're decomposing it. In fact, the decomposition is essential to be able to improve your soil organic matter. What we are looking at as scientists, not in this particular project, but as a community, is what we refer to as the carbon use efficiency. So how much biomass do organisms produce while they're eating that compost, for example, versus how much do they blow off and respire because they're generating energy. And so more and more we're starting to look at which management practices are going to maximize the amount that goes into biomass and secondary metabolites without blowing as much off to generate energy. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. It's not an easy home run to hit. We'd all like to do it. That we disturb the soil to fight away the weeds. The organic system is pretty much mechanically, and we add these nutrients. We'd love to build soil. We'd like to get to a place where we could just mow kind of under the vine and between the vines, and yet it's hard to get the amount of nutrients we'd like, especially on the table grapes more than the wine grapes.
Yeah. So I'm just making sure I understand the question correctly. Are you asking about how to balance reducing your tillage versus trying to build compost while you need your tillage to be able to deal with weeds and to speed up decomposition, to release some of these nutrients, stuff like that?
I think, yeah, all of those things come into play. It's not a simple system. Like you were mentioning, the soil microorganism community is so diverse. So we don't even have a clue who they all are. We haven't named them all, let alone how many of each. And so all our farming practices are very interrelated, and they're playing back on the crop we're developing. But I'm trying to be a more responsible farmer that's going to put away a little bit of carbon, try to build up more and more carbon in the soil, like in a forest soil, like up in the Northwest, with a nice pod soil. I've got the litter duff humus, from the last 20,000 years since the glaciers backed off, right? We haven't disturbed it. So they're doing a heck of a lot better in that forest than what I'm doing in my vineyard. And to create the productivity to justify paying the people and delivering the crop. So it's what's the mix of practices? Like Kevin, my compost is heavily leaning towards animal products, from a dairy or from steers. And do I need to go look for some other product to mix in that would stick to the soil longer? And I know you don't have the answers today. I'm thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, these are great questions. And it's like, I think a lot of the data that's out there is on implementation of single practices. And there's less data out there of like stacking practices, right? Or, you know, all these nuances you're talking about, like which kind of compost. So that's definitely, these are such good questions. And I think that's where we're lacking, and we're still really need to continue looking for better answers. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Charlotte.
Okay, well, I think we're a little, I don't want to be respectful of everyone's time. If there is any more questions, we could stay on, but for now, I'll just say thanks for everyone for joining us today. I'll make the recording available. I'll send it out in an email at the end of the day, but yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. Hopefully we'll have a in-person field day next time. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Grant, thank you. Charlotte, nice to see you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
nice to see you.
Kat and Sam, thanks for joining in.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. Thank you, Grant.
Yeah,
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I've got a question for perennial weed control. If anybody's listening, I was wondering how good is the optimizer for hard to kill perennial weeds?
It basically depends on the how they're seeding. The optimizer will uproot every weed that it covers. So, as long as it hasn't produced its seeds yet, it'll take them out, or at least kill it, uproot it. So sometimes we try to get in there twice if we have a really difficult weed problem. Take them out and then let the ground get wet, give the seeds a chance to sprout from those perennial weeds, and then run again and uproot them before they've had a chance to produce seeds. So it can be a two-pass process to take them out.
So you'll use the optimizer a second time then?
Yeah, in that case, if there are seeds in the ground that they're concerned about, they'll run it again maybe a month or two after, when the weeds have had a chance to sprout. That way you're able to eradicate most of the problem.
The challenge I have, and mine is an organic grain system, and so trying to find a proper tillage tool that will do all the weed control that I need in one pass is extremely difficult. I've tried various implements to do that, but all of them fall short on dandelions or absinthe or Canada thistle. You come back and you're wanting to seed into that ground, and those hard to kill perennial weeds are coming back. And so trying to find an ultimate machine that will do that and conserve moisture, because in my particular scenario, I mean that every tillage pass, I mean, is probably no different than yours. I mean, we're losing topsoil moisture, and that's been absolutely critical these last few years, because we're not getting our timely rains that we normally would get later on in late spring, early summer.
No, we see that. We definitely come across that. I think one thing the optimizer does have that not all other implements have is complete coverage on the full working width of the implement. So we don't skip any sections where there might be weeds remaining between the blades. The blades do cover the entire working width. So every single weed that's growing out of the ground will be overturned and uprooted.
Are there any implements close to the 49th parallel? Are there any up in Canada or the northern United States?
The most northern implements we have are mostly in Idaho, but that is, that's not quite Montana level. There are some in Washington, so I'd say Washington's probably our farthest north market at this point.
Well, I'd like to see you bring one up here.
Yeah, we'd be happy to.
Where are you located?
I am 20 miles from the North Dakota border, about 90 miles from Minot, North Dakota.
Okay.
Just into Saskatchewan.
Oh, okay.
Any other?
So
Go for it, Kat.
oh, I wondered, so you have a big issue with frozen soil, that you have to, wait till your soil thaws out enough to do a late spring tillage? Or do you tend to till in fall?
Well, you can do either up here. Usually most producers are on the land by mid to late April, and depending